Welcome to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Tad Hussey of Kiss Organics. This is the podcast where we discuss the cutting edge of growing from a science-based perspective and draw on top experts from around the industry to share their wisdom and knowledge. My guest this week is Dr. Eleanor Kuntz. Eleanor is a trained herbalist and geneticist bridging the gap between traditional herbalism and modern science. She is the CEO and co-founder of LeafWorks, a botanical verification company using genetics to improve medicinal quality, sustainability, and transparency in the supply chain. She is also co-founder of Canndor, the people's herbarium, the first herbarium committed to documenting and preserving cannabis cultivars and varietals along with the collective knowledge gained through community engagement. This is her second time on the show, and if you are interested in learning more about herbariums, we talk more extensively about it in the other podcast. In honor of this podcast release, we will be offering 10% off on the LeafWorks Gender ID kits through the Kiss Organics website for a limited time. We talk about the benefits of these kits and how it works in the podcast, along with other topics around cannabis genetics. Now on to the show. Hey, Eleanor, thanks for coming on the show.
Hi, it's so great to be here.
Yeah, I wanted to start off, the last time we talked on the show, we talked a lot about Canndor and intellectual property and those things, and it was a great podcast, but I wanted to follow up with you and talk a little bit more about LeafWorks this time. So why don't you give us a brief overview of Canndor for people who might not have heard that podcast, and then we can really dive into LeafWorks.
Excellent. Yeah. So Canndor is a cannabis herbarium. It's the first and only dedicated cannabis herbarium. And what that is a repository of physical pressed specimens that help to define the diversity and the cultivars and varietals or strains that we see that have been held in the community and have been lovingly not only bred and differentiated, but caretaked by many, many individuals over decades. And so Canndor is really a spot where we can just look at those plants and have a place where the community can define the plants that they're working with.
Yeah, I highly suggest if people are interested in learning about herbariums to listen to that podcast, because I learned a ton of stuff there that I had no idea about from talking to you guys. And that's a separate project completely.
Yes, it's a totally separate project. It's really a project that grew out of necessity. So LeafWorks at its core, its fundamental core, is a botanical identification company. And so the entire goal of LeafWorks is to know what you're buying, selling, and growing. And that really extends into the entire herbal market, so the natural products market. So, when you go into a health food store or your local grocery store and you buy either a tea or a tincture or an herbal supplement, you have a list of ingredients that are in that product. And what we do is, as a third-party verifier, we look at those botanicals that are going into that product and verify. If it says there's Echinacea purpurea in there, we verify there is, in fact, Echinacea purpurea in there, and there aren't any other plants in there as filler. And so this is a really big deal, and in the natural food space, it's required that you have a third party or a verification of the botanicals that are going into your products. You can't just say you're selling ginkgo and then, sell celery instead.
Yeah.
And it's important because in the botanical trade, there's actually quite a lot of fraud, which is, I guess, an unfortunate truth. And some of this fraud is purposeful, so it's very much like we're going to add these plants into this mix because the adulterant plants are cheaper and we're going to make some money. So a lot of the fraud is purposeful, but some of the fraud is inadvertent. So you have plants that are wildcrafted or harvested, and occasionally people are going to pick the wrong things. And so what we do is we work to identify those botanical materials that are going into products to verify that they are, in fact, the thing that we think they are, or that they're, that the label is saying that they are. So when we started to do work in cannabis, we realized, it's hard to do that. If you say it's Bubba Kush or you say it's Tangy or you say it's cookies, how do you really know you're getting that plant? And so that's where we started with cannabis. And really looking into that. And so as a botanical identification company, if we're going to make a test to verify that you have ginkgo inside that product, the first thing we do is go to an herbarium and get herbarium samples that have been vetted by a botanist that is an expert in the particular plant of interest, in this case ginkgo. And we use those herbarium specimens as reference material, certified reference material, which is a very important thing in not only science, but in the botanical trade. And so once you have the certified reference material, you can then use this as your gold standard to make, in our case, a genetic assay that is going to identify that plant based on a reference material that we know is 100% the material we're looking for. And so when we moved into cannabis and we're really looking to do this value add for our cannabis customers and our growers, there wasn't this vital resource where we could find certified reference material. And so if there isn't something out there, what do you have to do? You have to build it yourself. And so that's how Canndor came into existence, was this lack of this very important resource that the community really needs in order to be able to empower themselves to define their material. And so we really are just the vessel that holds that information for the community.
So just to make sure I'm understanding you correctly, like, for example, if someone wanted to know if this plant was truly, let's just stick with tangy, I guess, you would have to, because there's no good standard right now, I would think you'd have to collect a bunch of samples that people say, hey, I have a true, pure tangy genotype here, and then that would be your, you would kind of collect them all and throw out any outliers, and then that would become the standard for tangy moving forward. Is that, how does this work in an industry where we don't have an existing standard, I guess? Yeah.
So for some plants it's very difficult, and other plants it's very easy. And so if we're working, so we worked a lot with Subcool before he passed. So that was a very easy way of defining plants. They were his plants. He was a breeder. He was putting propagules into the market. And so we took his plants. If they were clones, super easy. We're going to take a pressing of the clone. We're going to use that as our reference standard. A lot of his crosses were seed crosses, so same mom, same dad. So we would take a sample of the dad, we take samples of mom, and then we take a panel of the siblings and say, this is the breadth of diversity that now is, cherrygasm, or whatever the plant is that we were speaking about in that moment. Mm-hmm. And so those types of definitions, when you're working with a breeder, so we also work with, organizations like Humboldt Seed Company, organizations that are breeding and putting propagules into the market, it's a much more straightforward, cut and dry kind of definition. When you're working with things that are like Bubba Kush, or things that are like community standards, things that have been traded around and in the community for a very long time, it's much more of what you described. What we do is we take many samples from organizations that have held the material for a long time. We take in all of the information we have, where they got the plant, how long they've had the plant, the important characteristics that define that plant. And we will take a wide swath of those individuals and then compare them to one another and say, okay, out of these 80 samples or 10 samples, depending on how great our sampling is, this, these, let's say it's 10 samples, these 9 are all holding together, and this one doesn't fit, and so we're going to throw it out as an outlier. Mm-hmm. And so it's sort of like eating an elephant. You just start where you're at, and you get as much information as you can, and you do this low-hanging fruit first, the ones that are easier, where you still can communicate with a breeder, specific person that's doing that work.
Yeah.
And then there's other plants that are sort of in community. You have the community help you. You have multiple people who, oh, I know I gave this to this person in the 80s, or a really good examples of Harlequin. So Wade Laughter is the original breeder of Harlequin. He knows that he gave some of those plants to be sold to Harborside during a certain period of time. So then I run into an individual that's like, oh, I bought this plant, in 92 from Harborside. Then I have confidence that it's the same plant. And then when we compare them, we see that, yes, they do genetically hold up, and they physically hold up when we compare the herbarium specimens to one another and the, characteristics that are driving the phenotype of the plant. So it's a little bit of investigation, but it's really having the community lead us to where we need to get to make the definition of the plant.
So can
And it's a
you,
lot like any other plant.
yeah, so basically, can you say that like let's just take the example with Harlequin. Um, you could say that a plant then has no Harlequin actually in it, like if they claimed it was a Harlequin cross, and then conversely, if Harlequin was derived, and I'm not into the plant genetics like some people are, let's say it was derived from another cultivar originally, or another varietal, would you be able to see that in the Harlequin? So you could say, oh, this was originally pulled, it had a little bit of, kush in it, or a little bit of something
Or, yeah,
else.
catatonic, or yes, you can definitely do that. And you need a lot of information to do that, some genetic information. But yes, that is part of what we do. Is some individuals will come to us and say, "I think I have this," and then we make sure we have enough of the reference samples to be able to investigate. Is it that? And we can look and see if that is a possible parental cross for a mystery plant.
Mm-hmm.
Or we can take a plant where someone thinks they have what they think they know what they have, and then we look at it and we can either say, yes, it looks like it is in this line, it looks like it is a cross of these individuals, or no, we can't find any evidence of this particular plant in its pedigree.
So this is kind of an off question too. I'm wondering, how often do you just see plants that have the same physical morphology or growth habits that, and someone might think it's a cookies, for example, and then you do the genetic testing on it and you're like, this really isn't related to cookies, or even though it may look similar. Does that happen?
Yeah, it does happen. It absolutely happens. The cannabis is an amazingly plastic plant. So plasticity is this kind of cool genetic term where the environment really affects the phenotype. So you can have the same phenotype looking very different in different environments. And conversely, you can have a lot of different genotypes converging on similar phenotypes. So there's a lot of complexity, and one of those aspects is the plasticity of cannabis. So it's a beautiful aspect, and it's also a challenging aspect of the plant.
Yeah. Now I've been saying, and maybe you'll correct me here, that cannabis, one, is probably at some of the greatest diversity we've ever seen and may ever see with this plant, just because of this latest surge of legalization and breeding. But I assume over time, with capitalism and commercialism, we're going to see diversity go down. But it seems like we're at sort of a peak in that regard. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that. And then along those lines, in terms of diversity, are you feeling like we're still discovering new things regarding the genetics of cannabis and learning more every day, or do you feel like you're starting to get a handle for what this plant contains?
Oh man, well, to answer the first question, cannabis is exceptionally diverse. It is sort of it is the best example of the more you love something, the more diverse you'll make it. I think we have a couple of excellent examples as humans. In the plant world, I think we can point to roses. Anything that we just love so much, we really make the diversity that we have access to. We expand it and we explode the types of plants that we have around us. So yeah, you can definitely see that in a lot of our ornamentals, but I think roses is a big one, and dogs is another one, right? So
yeah,
how can you take a wolf and make all of the different breeds that we have? And it's just the same thing. Like anything that we love or find useful, we as humans are very good at caretaking things that could never survive on their own. And in doing that, we really do expand that diversity in this immense and awesome way. And I think cannabis is absolutely a really good poster child for that. The amount of difference that we have, not only in smells and statures and leaf shape is kind of a mind-boggling. And I don't think we're at a limit. I don't think we're at the end of that. I feel like as we not move away, I don't think we'll ever move away for growing cannabis for its chemistry, but I think that we will return to growing cannabis for a lot of other purposes as well, especially as the hemp movement gains traction and that aspect of agriculture expands. I think we're going to see a lot more diversity. I think we're going to see a lot more cannabis and, hemp, it's the same plant. So a lot more cannabis that is specifically grown for fibers or to be useful in concrete type applications or packaging applications. And so I think we're going to see a lot of expansion of diversity in those realms in the near future, in addition to just the fact that every time we look at the plant, we find more chemicals that are doing more amazing things. It's like THCV or CBDG or CBN or any of these compounds. The more we look and investigate, the more we find it's really this treasure trove of amazing pharmacopoeial chemistry that, as humans, we really resonate with our own endocannabinoid system. So I think the diversity in cannabis is only going to increase as we understand it more. And so that really gets at the genetics. And, we're really just at the very, very tip of the iceberg with understanding the genetics of cannabis. One of the things I like to say quite often is really comparing it to corn. So when I went to grad school, the university that I was at, I think just in the building I was in the botany, or I was in the genetics department. That department, I think, had 7 labs working on corn. And then if you went over to the botany department, you would probably add 5 or 6 additional labs. And then if you went over to the ag department, you'd add 5 or 6 more. And so, you have 20, 30 labs at a single institution that work on corn. And I think if you play that forward with cannabis, the same thing is going to happen because we really don't know very much. Prohibition has really limited our understanding of the science of these plants. And, it takes a lot of work to really drive down and understand specific genes that are driving phenotypes. I mean, we can get some broad strokes pretty easily, but to really understand the interplay of the entire genetic architecture, so all of the genes and all of the other components in the genetics that drive a particular phenotype, I mean, that's years of research and lots of minds, like, time on task. So I feel like we're going to learn more and more, and the next decade is going to be a very cool time to be interested in genetics of cannabis.
I have so many questions.
Yay!
Yeah. So the one thing that your recent comments just now made me think about, though, was a friend had sent me an article on researchers. It was in Nature. I can post it on the podcast page when we're done. Of scientists brewing cannabis using beer yeast, the Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and I was wondering if you'd seen anything on that, because they're actually able to turn certain compounds into THC. Obviously, you're not going to get the full collection of diversity in compounds that you get in a cannabis plant. I know as scientists, a lot of scientists are very derivative. They're trying to break down these, individual compounds like THC. We're seeing synergistic effects between, different cannabinoids and terpenes, and how they all kind of play a role together in terms of an experience for a user or a medical effect. How do you think this is going to change? As someone who's a geneticist, how do you take an article like this, and how do you think that's going to affect our industry?
Yeah, I think it's going to affect it in a lot of different ways, but I really do look to the precedent that's really been set with herbalism and the natural products world. We know that we can extract chemicals from plants and use them in a very pointed way. And as in my science brain, I completely understand the need to approach things in that derivative kind of way. And it's really just to simplify it enough so that we can understand things about how chemicals are either derived or how they're specifically functioning within a particular system or on a particular cell type. And so I think those derivative type of experiments, that derivative or that very like, let's look at one chemical at a time kind of thinking is exceptionally important to deepen our understanding. But I don't necessarily think it produces the best medicine. So I don't think that our, understanding and utility are not the same thing in my world. So I definitely have a deep appreciation for that kind of work and the need for that kind of work. But when we really look to something, when we really look at herbal medicine in general, we often find that just because we can pinpoint a chemical that has 80 or 90% of the effect on whatever pathology that we're looking at, it doesn't mean that it is effective at curing the pathology. And I think we'll see that with cannabis, especially with the ensemble or entourage effect with the multitude of chemicals that are acting in concert. I think it becomes so complex to really understand how all of those things are really affecting your, positive outcome. I don't think we're going to be able to replace the benefits of the herbal medicine with a pill. I don't think it's in our best interest to do that, but you're also speaking to someone who has a lot of faith and confidence in herbal medicine as especially as a primary medicinal modality. I mean, Western medicine is amazing at what it does, and there's no escaping the need for like acute medicine at certain times. But if you're looking at more holistic medicine, especially food as medicine and herbs as medicine for health and longevity and vitality, you're never going to get that in a derivative product, as far as I'm concerned. And so, it'll be much like anything. Sometimes we're going to be able to find a single molecule that has like 90% of the effect to make something, cure something or have, the positive medicinal effect that we need. But I don't think that's going to be the norm. I think it's much more complicated than that. And, the chemistry of cannabis is radical. There's so much going on. I think that the plant medicine is still going to be really important, and the plants themselves. And I think the industry can really lean on that, especially as we understand more and more about the diversity of plants, how different plants do better in different areas, right? So we're going to start, I think, appellations and the real understanding of that interaction between the genotypes, the different plants themselves, and the environments in which they're in, and how that really affects the quality of those plants. I think that's going to be the most exciting information that we, dig into in the next couple years.
Okay. Yeah. I'm curious to see too. I mean, my brain was just thinking while you were talking about how I could see potentially people using, THC compounds derived from yeast to boost their THC numbers in their final product, even if that product had, kind of like what you were describing with fillers and the supplement industry at the beginning of the podcast.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I can see people extracting terpenes not only from cannabis, from other, if you want something that tastes like limonene, I mean, it's easier to get it from some citrus than it is from, I mean, I think there will be a market for that, and there will be players who that feels like the best solution. And I think we're going to have different quality metrics, and that's going to be a very interesting thing to watch, especially as someone who sits here as like a third-party lab, someone who is really trying to communicate the essence of the material that's being sold, so that not only can individuals who have special material articulate that to their consumers, but so that consumers can start making choices about what they want. And I think that'll be the real power is how does the the consumer move the ball forward, right? Like, does the consumer want a high THC product, even if it means we're spraying yeast-driven THC on flower? Maybe not. And so I think we'll be able to, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either.
It's a weird thing, right? Like, it's some people want to, and you look at the alcohol industry, I know it's not the best example or the best parallel, but, sometimes you want a table wine and you don't care that it's 3 different kinds of grapes and, it comes in a box. Like, that's what the situation calls for. And then other times, it's a celebration and you want a very special Pinot Noir from the Willamette Valley, And so I think we're going to have that kind of product differentiation, and that's what's going to add, in my mind, the value to the smaller family farm or the craft farm where they're really growing a specific kind of plant in a specific area. And the quality is what's going to drive, the value of that product.
Now, using your alcohol example, I would look at it a different way. I would say, hey, we have a market for wine, because I want a glass of wine. I don't want ethanol, like I want something that has flavor. I want to have something that has enjoyment. I'm not looking for just the effect of being like, inebriated. So that to me is sort of like a cannabis versus, THC product derived from another source. But growing cannabis is hard, commercially it's difficult. Yeah. So I do see where something like this could gain traction, and it concerns me a little bit, but I was just curious from like a geneticist perspective what you were thinking. So.
Yeah, well, there's this great little like meme that's going around about, potency and effects. And I think as we as consumers get over the novelty of being allowed to interact with cannabis in a legal way, I think that novelty's got to kind of wear off, so that instead of just having this giddiness about being able to have access, we can all of a sudden say, oh, it's not, oh, I can get it. It's, oh, what do I really want? And I think you're right. I don't just want ethanol. I would like something that is delicious. And so I feel like as we lose the novelty of being able to access the plant, then we'll have much more of a discerning kind of palate-driven consumer.
Yeah.
But, it remains to be seen how it'll really play out. But I don't think that everyone just wants to get inebriated. Most people want it to taste good, and that's, it's also us growing up as a consumer too.
Yeah,
and learning about what's out there. It's hard to know what you want if you haven't had a lot of experience too.
Absolutely. I was just going to say, for folks who haven't listened to my podcast with Dr. Adi Ray, where she talks literally just about this topic and the idea of applying science to user experience, and how THC is not the driver when you start doing blind tests with people in terms of what creates a better experience. It's really interesting. Mm-hmm. I need to follow up with her, but she's working with Jeremy Plum and Stephanie Barnhart, and they have a really cool thing that they're doing in Portland around this concept. So I will have to follow up with her and ask her the same question at some point in the future.
I would love to hear that follow up, because it is true. It's absolutely true. Like, right, the teenager's like, yeah, I'll drink some ethanol. Mm-hmm. But, me, I'm not going to do that. So I completely am curious about how it kind of, I'm curious about how the education of the consumer goes, because that's also a very important aspect of, deepening understanding of the plant and the value that differentiates different kinds of growing methods and different kinds of plants themselves.
Absolutely. So there was something I wanted to ask you a little while back here while we were talking, and I didn't want to forget. So as someone who loves growing tomatoes, I will choose varieties that finish sooner, I'll tend to choose determinate plants depending on how much height I have. I'll look for things that have some level of resistance, like may not be as likely to get powdery mildew or rust or, whatever crop I'm growing. I look for those, disease resistance in the varietals that I choose for my vegetables. Are we making any progress in that regard with cannabis? Are you starting to see markers associated with some level of resistance to certain pathogens?
Yeah, we definitely are slowly making strides. The hard thing with both susceptibility and resistance is that very, very rarely is it a single gene situation where you have this gene and you are resistant to this. That's sort of the exception rather than the rule. And so those types of plants are going to be complicated to breed in a lot of ways, and especially because there's this really interesting and dynamic interplay between a lot of the molecules we really like in cannabis that taste good. A lot of those are also the molecules that plants are using to defend against their own pests and predators, whether they be insects or viruses. And so there is this moment where sometimes breeding things to make them more resistant will make them less flavorful. And I mean, we see that in a lot of plants. And that's really just understanding the plant and understanding how to decouple those things so you don't lose the characteristics you like while moving the plant in a direction that makes it more robust to pests and pathogens. And we're definitely making moves in that direction, but I think it'll be a long and complicated process to really hone in on the nuances of all of the different aspects of the plants, especially when you're looking at flavonoids and terpenes and all of those taste molecules, smell molecules, in addition to yield and water usage. And there's so many things when looking at a plant. And in a lot of ways, we have, as a community, a cannabis community, selected plants that are really great at producing the chemistry we want and not super great at living, because especially if you're doing it inside, you can really baby that plant in a way that is just not going to work at scale. And so I think we're going to have a little bit of a challenge to take some of those plants that have been bred in that extreme flavor direction without any regard to, can the plant stand up on its own? The plant might have glorious colas, but if the stems aren't strong enough to hold them up, it becomes more of a challenge to grow. And so I think we're going to have to undo some of those issues that we inadvertently created by growing in the styles that we've been growing through Prohibition.
Yeah. So 2 points I want to make. One, resistance too is a sliding scale. Like you may have a room with a bunch of cultivars and one may be less likely to get it or not display as many symptoms to, let's say, botrytis or powdery mildew. But that's not to say that if your spore pressure gets high enough, it's not ever going to get it. So, I think we have to be careful with the word resistance when people think of what genetics. And then the other thing I wanted to mention around it was, just that, when we talk about this level of diversity in these plants, it makes it really hard to really know what we're seeing over time, I think. So, someone may say this plant didn't get powdery mildew. Well, like I said, you don't know how much spore pressure you had in the room. And maybe your cover crop gets it, but it's not the same powdery mildew that affects cannabis. There's all these different variables. So it's I totally agree. It's going to be a long journey in that regard.
Absolutely. And I think that point that you made is right, is hitting the nail on the head. It's just this dance between, something may not get root rot, but if you put it in standing water, it's probably going to rot, so it's definitely, that interplay with the environment, whether it be the number of pests or the kind of pests. And yeah, some things are going to be better equipped to deal with it, but it is a scale. So that's a very important point. I'm glad you made that.
Yeah, and I also, you brought up the point of how we were breeding during Prohibition. Well, I think at that point in time, unfortunately, there were a lot of growers using systemic fungicides. So you were able to grow these like massive buds that literally would not get botrytis because they had, your people were using Eagle 20. And
Yeah.
so you cannot grow these things to the same size and scale without getting botrytis, organically for the most part. So we're kind of working backwards from some of that stuff too, I think.
I agree. I totally agree.
Yeah.
And for some plants, moving them outside is going to help them. And other plants are just not going to cut it. They're just outside is going to be a violent and dangerous place for them, and they're not going to be able to survive. So, and that's okay. I think we're going to utilize the beauty of those plants and use them in breeding programs, and I think a lot of that diversity is going to help us understand, basically the genetics that underpin the characteristics that we love, so that we can track those characteristics down in plants that are better suited for environments and situations that don't, need massive amounts of water or massive amounts of fungicide. I mean, that's just not gonna work in a market where you're, testing your plants for human health.
Yeah. Your outdoor comment brought up another question for me. So I hear a lot of talk around genetic drift or genetic degradation with clones. I've heard people say you have to move, take your clone and then grow it outdoors and breed it every 4 years or whatever length of time. What are you seeing, with people who are cloning the same plant over and over again? Are you seeing a lot of genetic drift over time or mutation slowly on a given, clone?
I don't think anyone has enough really good data to give a robust answer to that. You do see some genetic drift. That is something we see. I'll look at clones or clone operations, and things aren't 100% identical. They're 99.8 or 99.9% identical. So there is definitely somatic mutations that happen. I think that the health and well-being of clones, though, from at least what I have seen in the experiences that we've had at LeafWorks and the groups that we've worked with, looking at this kind of question, most of the time when we have plants that just aren't doing very well, and the idea of bringing them outside, it's generally pest and pathogen load that's doing the damage. It's not the drifting of the genetics. The genetics are similar enough, 99.9% similar, and there are other external circumstances that are driving the decline in the plants, not so much just the fact that it's a clone.
Okay.
So,
I could see that.
Yeah,
there's certain things that are systemic that, in terms of diseases that could cause a different, poorer expression of that plant over time if you're cloning it. I could definitely see that.
And just like anything, if you're cloning it and you have a plant that's 30 years old, it's had 30 years to acquire bugs along the way, whether they be viruses or just pressure from other predators. A newly germinated seed is, it's like a baby. It hasn't had as many negative interactions to affect it.
Does extreme stress affect genetic expression over time? Let's say you had a plant that had you had a big mite problem. Will that potentially cause greater genetic drift or other issues?
There's no evidence that it creates greater genetic drift, but what it does do is it can change gene expression. So anything that stresses a plant out absolutely affects gene expression. And so that can be positive or it can be negative. We have certain medicinal plants that you actually want to whack back or cut all of the leaves right before you're going to harvest the medicinal part of the plant, because the emulation of predators, like eating the leaves, will boost the production of the phytochemistry that you're actually interested in as a person using the plant for a medicinal purpose, right? And so that's an odd one where predation actually increases the chemistry that you're looking for. And that happens in certain plants. And I'm sure we'll see that with cannabis. Heat stress is going to, we see that with cannabis in ways
we already do
want,
see it.
right? Like
yeah.
Heat stress makes them herm and do all these things. And so we definitely see changes in the gene expression based on stressors, for sure.
But that's not necessarily going to carry on to the next generation, or even necessarily into a clone. Like, let's say you had a vegetative plant before cloning it, that just went through a variety of stress. Let's say you forgot to water it, maybe it got too hot, maybe didn't get enough light, whatever, and you nurse it back to health. At that point, I know as a human, like, my cortisol levels have probably gone through the roof and then come back down. But am I passing that on to my children at some point when I have a child? Or, like, in this case, if you're cloning a plant, is that getting passed on, or is that just go away?
Yeah, so it's going to go away more easily if you go through a seed round, right? Because the genetics are transferred. Epigenetics, so things that change expression, so like it change methylation patterns and how things are regulated. That is much more damaging. Epigenetic change, like epigenetics, are not heritable in the same way that like the DNA is heritable. And so cloning, though, you're not actually going through a gamete. You're not actually going through, sexual reproduction. And so cloning, you can actually carry those epigenetic changes on for a lot longer, right? Like, some of those changes are permanent and you can't undo them. And so that stress really can affect the plant more long-term as a clone.
That's so interesting.
Just like, like there's these great twin studies that we've done as humans where, one twin will smoke, or one twin will run marathons all the time, whatever it is. And it changes the epigenetic context of their genetics. So they have differential expression of different genes and thus have differential health as a result of their actions in, positive and negative ways. And so I'm positive as we dig in and look more closely at these things, especially because we can look at them with we have clones. That's like the best thing for a geneticist to be able to understand anything, is to be able to look at clones. And so I feel like we're gonna understand more and more about this as we go. But yes, we can expect that epigenetics will remain in a clone a lot longer. Epigenetic changes will remain in a clone a lot longer than plants that are going through sexual reproduction.
That's so fascinating. Now, before I forget, though, I wanted to cover sort of the elephant in the room. We talked about this in the last podcast, but people are sending you plant samples, leaf tissue, enough for you to be able to do these types of genetic testing. What, as a grower, what are the risks associated with that in regard to protecting and preserving intellectual property or that plant themselves that they feel that they have some level of ownership over?
Well, LeafWorks is very, very direct about our genetic data policy. So any plants that we take in to do a test, whether it be a gender ID test where we're helping you sex your plants early, or other tests looking at different either cultivar ID test, or sort of we do a double check just to make sure that you have the plant you think you have. All of those tests, we just run the test, and that's all we do. We also have a very robust genetic data program where we work with a lot of different breeders and growers and look at the diversity of their plants, and we do different things to understand the genetics that underpin characteristics that those growers are really interested in, whether it be flowering time or chemical production. So we do have an active research side of the company, but those research projects are separate from you're going to send me your plants to do gender ID. Those plants don't cross over at all. in our process. So we have a very very strict. If you send us something to do a test on, that's the only thing we do with that sample. And because we have such a vested interest in really promoting the diversity that exists in the cannabis community and helping those individuals that have taken the time to not only develop all of these different plants, but steward them and keep them safe and protected over the last decades. We really work very, very closely and very hard with organizations that have special plants to define those plants so that they can gain that intellectual property. And so I think that's something that is confusing for a lot of people. Like, what is the intellectual property that I own as a grower or a breeder? And really, any plant that's been in the community for more than a year, you can't own. And that, for the most part, is a really good thing. And I think if we were talking about any other plants, everyone's like, no, you shouldn't own plants. But then people get weird when they start talking about cannabis plants. And there's this different attitude about these plants. And in order to really own a plant, you have to have done work to breed something special and unique. And the best way to define that is to define it in the way that we define all other plants, which is to make herbarium pressings and write a botanical description that enumerates why that particular plant, cultivar, varietal is special and unique, and what are the characteristics that make that plant special and unique. And so when we take in plants to do cultivar registration, that's exactly what we do. We take those plants, we work with Canndor to make herbarium pressings, we do genetics that are then linked to those herbarium pressings so that there's something tangible to link those genetics to, right? Genetics in a vacuum mean nothing. I think that's really important. So, if I go to my local dispensary and buy a pre-roll and then sequence it, even if I'm the first one to sequence that plant, it does not mean I own anything, right? Like, it's kind of like going to the store and deciding I'm going to buy a Gala apple and sequence it, and then tell everyone that I own Gala apples because I have the sequence of it. I mean, that doesn't really make much sense. But we have this idea that that's how you gain ownership of plants in the cannabis realm. And it's a false promise that I think a lot of genetic organizations are giving to people. The sequence data really means nothing, especially because just like anything, I mean, we look at the sequence differences between chimps and humans, and right, we're almost the same at the sequence level. And that is also true with the plants. You have to really understand what is the phenotype that makes this plant different. And you have to describe that in order to gain any kind. So the most important thing in gaining IP protection, if you have something that is eligible, is to do botanical description. The genetics are kind of the icing on the cake. They're not, you need the cake to do it. You don't need the icing. And so the genetics really just add value. They're not the driver of any kind of IP application that you would do for a plant in general.
Okay, so let me try and summarize my understanding of this, and please correct me anywhere in here if I screw up. So let's just say I'm a grower and I have a very special plant that I think is unique, and I want to preserve it and have some level of ownership over it because of the amount of time and energy I put into breeding it. So I would at this point need to reach out to a lab, and it has to be a lab that I feel comfortable with and trust. I'd want to read their genetic data policy so I know exactly what they're giving me and what I'm giving them in regards to information and plant material. So that would be the start. And then in order for that DNA sequencing to have any value, it has to be tied to an herbarium based on how we currently value or view ownership of plants. So this is sort of unique to plants as I understand it. And then at that point, having those two things tied together and having this information from a lab would allow me to have some sort of legal framework around which to show that I own this plant. Oh, and this plant also has to have not been out in the world for more than a year publicly. Does that kind of cover it?
Those are the rules, yes, for plants. Okay. And plants, plant IP is not is not easy. You can get a plant patent in there. You have to specifically show like how you've altered it, and it's generally for clonal type propagation. And then if you have seeds and things, you can get plant varietal protections, which, so there's different nuances, and a lawyer is going to be able to really articulate those. Mm-hmm. But the most fundamental aspect is really the botanical description. So it's the same thing like if we went off into some uncharted territory and found a new orchid. Like the first thing we're going to do when we find that new orchid or develop a new plant, right? Just breed a new cannabis plant. It's the same thing. So if you find this new plant or breed this new plant, the first thing you do is do that botanical description to describe what it is. That's always linked to a physical sample, right? So you have to have a tangible thing to reference. And then the genetics really are just the icing. And the nice thing about the genetic work that we do with breeders is a lot of breeders want to then license their plants to different farms. And so they go through this process of writing these beautiful licensing agreements. They pay a lawyer a lot of money, and then they don't have any way to enforce that license. And so the genetics that we do are really just a tool that then that breeder can utilize to audit. They can audit their grower. Are you growing the right plants? Are you giving these plants to someone you shouldn't be? Now I can sample those plants and say, oh wait, these are my plants. They shouldn't be here. So you can really
that makes a lot of sense.
Your contract instead, so it's really just a tool. It doesn't. It's a valuable tool, but it doesn't like give you anything just because you have the genetics, right? Because anyone can sequence anything. Like there's no rules about that.
And around that note, if someone sends you plant material, we were talking a little bit before the podcast about this. You mentioned this wasn't like a Jurassic Park situation where you can completely recreate this plant and then start, growing and selling this plant yourself. The sequencing doesn't give you that kind of power. What does it give you?
Yeah, so the sequencing gives you a couple things. The first thing is really that that toolkit. It's really a bunch of tools. So genetics gives you tools to track plants. So in this licensing example, to be able to track plants through a system or through different growers. It also gives you the ability, if you know that this plant smells like blueberries, right? You can then utilize genetics and compare 10 plants that smell like blueberries to plants that don't smell like blueberries. And then you can whittle down between that comparison. What are those things that are driving the smell that you're interested in? And so once you have those tools, then you can look in, and you have to have your own breeding stock, right? Like you can't just recreate breeding stock with genetics. So then you can use those genetic tools to screen your breeding stock to find things that are most likely to smell like blueberries, if that's what you're after. So it's really just a toolkit that can help facilitate and streamline breeding so that instead of having to grow 1,000 plants and do the chemistry for all of them, you can say, oh, out of these 1,000 plants, these 100 are most likely to smell like blueberries. So I'm going to grow them and focus on them. And then, breeding is iterative, so you're going to still have to do more work on those plants to get where you're going. But what those genetics do is they give you a toolkit to make it easier.
So the big issue that people had with that company in Oregon that was collecting people's plants and genetic information to create this collection was that as a breeder, if I'm giving you a plant that I know is special and it's going to have these specific genetic markers that relate to its specialness, whether that's resistance or THC levels or, some synergistic effect of all the cannabinoids, as a lab that's collecting all this information, you can use the data, you're getting a larger and larger data set over time to where you can start saying, all of these plants that people are saying are special for this reason all have these same genetic markers. I'm going to work with a breeder now and say, hey, we're going to breed until we get these same genetic markers. And now we have an advantage over other growers because we can use this as an extra tool. Does Does that kind of summarize
Yeah.
what the anger and frustration was associated with?
Well, I think the anger and yeah, absolutely. And I think the anger and frustration really came from being duplicitous about the intent
Mm-hmm.
and selling a product that was sold at or under cost, not because you wanted to sell a product, but because you wanted to gain genetic information. Right? It's different when you're working with a breeder and you're saying, "Oh, we're going to do this project together, and we're going to push your material forward, and this is how we're working in synergy with one another."
Mm-hmm.
That's a very different model than I'm going to take all this information from individuals that may or may not want to help that cause, and I'm going to shift my direction as an organization. And at first, I'm going to tell you that I'm assaying genetic diversity for the greater good. And then you're going to shift your business model into, I'm going to be a producer of propagules and I'm going to compete with my customers.
Yeah.
And I think it's all
It's a
about intent,
tricky,
right?
yeah.
It's about what you're doing, and it's about, if you're a breeding organization, that's fine, but present yourself as a breeding organization. And I think that's the issue is, nobody likes to feel like they've been duped. And nobody likes to feel like they're dealing with someone who's duplicitous in their intent. And so I feel like that's really where the anger came from.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of people would still work with you if you say, this is what we're doing. You just have to be straightforward about what you're doing. And with this particular organization, I think the anger really came from saying a certain set of things in community settings, and then saying a very different set of goals when it was coming time to talking to their board or their investors. Right? Whatever you're saying to anybody about the trajectory of an organization, it should be the same no matter what room you're in. If you're in the investor room, or if you're in your client room, or
Mm-hmm.
you're in a community room. And I think that's the issue is, it's just not being straightforward. No one really likes that.
Yeah, I did an interview with Reggie Gaudino when he was with the CSO at Steep Hill Labs, and he was very clear about the fact that they are collecting this data and, what their potential plans were for it. But he also said, they could get bought out by Dow at some point, and that data might be used for something entirely different. And that's something you need to be aware of, and a risk associated with who you choose to work with. But ultimately, as a grower or breeder, you're going to have to pick a lab at some point if you want to have this genetic information. So it's a little bit of a catch-22. And for me, this happened to me in my industry. So my father did a lot of work in the infancy around compost tea, in terms of paying a lab to do a lot of testing around, how does water quality affect what microbes are grown out in our brewer, or how does changing these designs affect the microbial diversity or the food sources? Is E. coli able to grow in this brewer under these conditions? So, and he, spent tens of thousands of dollars on all this testing. And then, a few years later, this particular lab started selling compost tea brewers. And I was very, very frustrated, because all of us had been using this lab to do testing as sort of an independent resource. And now we were competing directly with them, and they had a huge advantage of having all of our tests and information. So I completely understand.
And that's the situation that happened. And I think it's important, when you're looking for a genetic testing company, so one of the things I'm so proud of about LeafWorks is our core mission is to help individuals define the plants that are in community. So it's doing cultivar registration. And the more of those cultivar registrations we can do, where we have vouchers and we have histories and we have breeding pedigrees, what it does is it immortalizes those plants in the community such that they can't be stolen. Right? You can't say that this is a unique plant that makes CBDN or whatever, and all plants that make this chemical I now own with this utility patent. I mean, some of the utility patents that are being put out by some of the other genetic companies that everyone is working with are so super overreaching. And if they would just look at the resource of the herbarium, or would look at the cultivar registrations that LeafWorks is doing, you would see, that patent is actually in violation of, all of is not appropriate. And I think that's part of the problem is we don't have resources for patent lawyers who are, looking over these applications to say that it's an overreaching patent. Like there's not the information. It's, you tell them this is the only plant that makes this particular ratio of chemicals, and they grant you that patent. And then I have someone over here that has a plant that has a completely different evolutionary background, is a different plant that makes the same pattern of chemicals. Like that would prove that was, that particular, especially the utility patents, should be, vetoed, should be thrown out. And so we have a dearth of information. And so that's one of the things that I'm so proud of LeafWorks for doing is the work that we do to define genetics helps to preserve and empower those people who have been holding those plants to be able to continue to use and breed with those plants. So you can't have someone come in and say, oh, I own this plant now, so you can't grow it anymore. Because we have proof that, well, you can't own it because this has been in community, or this has been bred, or this is a different version of the same thing. Whatever the story is that is going to give the power to know that those plants are out there. And that's part of the problem, because we don't know what plants are out there. You can have people say, this is unique and special and I own it. As opposed to, there's these utility patents. It's like between 2 and 5% THC and between 12 and 16% CBG. If it has that ratio, I own it. And it's like there's more than one evolutionary background that can produce that chemistry. It's like, but it's hard for people who are assigning, it's hard. I understand the patent lawyer, right? Like that doesn't know exactly how to judge these patent applications. So I think that we're going to have a lot of things thrown out, but documenting what we have is one of the most important ways to make sure that we have access to our material long term.
Okay, so what you're saying is it's not so much about owning something, but it's about keeping community access to it. So other people are going to be collecting information and potentially trying to claim ownership over it. But by having, Canndor and LeafWorks doing this work, potentially it allows the community to continue access to these plants without paying patents too. So it's not about just having a special plant, but it's about protecting our rights to all of this diversity and all these plants. Is that right?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, I never looked at it quite that way. So
yeah, it's both sides, right? It's and I think the tomato community has a really good framework for this, where you can breed tomatoes, but we have a really good understanding of what tomatoes are out there and which ones have patent protection and which ones don't. And if you breed something new, you also have a way to articulate that it's new. Like the Rose Society is great. Like if I breed a new rose, they have a registration of, the thousands of rose cultivars that are out there, and they can say, oh, guess what? This one is unique. You can give it its own name and its own, story around it. And so that's another important thing. You have to have this reference in order to be able to articulate that it is something new and novel.
That's great. Well, before we run out of time, I wanted, one of the questions I want to talk to you about was the advantages of gender testing. So you offer gender testing, you list in your genetic data policy that you destroy the samples. They're not associated with the other aspects of your company around the research program. So can you talk a little bit about why someone might want to do gender testing in terms of an ROI or the advantages around that?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you are growing from seed, there's a lot of different reasons why you'd want to do gender testing. The first and foremost is, of course, you can know the sex of that plant 7 to 10 days after germination. So as soon as you can take a little tiny piece of that plant or a little piece of the cotyledon and not kill the plant, you can know what the sex is. And that's great because depending on how you're growing and your growing style, you generally save, when we do our return on investment analysis, you save between 20 and 30% on your grow based on not having to spend the time on the labor, the materials, of repotting and transplanting, taking care of those plants until they show their sex. The other really great advantage is if you know which plants are girls and you're keeping only your girls, then you can get them into their final resting spot earlier, like their final pot. And so you don't have this issue where you're like waiting for them to show and then they're getting root bound. And so you just have healthier plants because they're getting into their spot earlier. Their roots are going to be healthier. And healthy roots, of course, as we all know, makes healthy plants. The other thing that's really nice is you know, especially with organizations that have square footage requirements, you really make sure you're using your space in the best way. You're not using some of your space to grow boys that then you're going to have to fill in with female plants after the fact. So you're really maximizing the number of plants that you can get into your space that can be productive for you in your production.
And plant count numbers for people dealing with that too. On the flip side, if you're a medical grower.
Totally.
Yeah, it's funny.
I have a couple growers that say the funniest things. Like I have one with Swami. I don't know if you know this wonderful human, but he said the funniest thing. He's like, I use you because I'm too old to sex those plants and my eyes aren't good anymore. And I was like, I don't know if I can put that on the website, but it was another reason why someone is using them. He's like, I just have to, he's like, it just is such a waste of time to have to walk around and look at those plants and then my eyes just can't always see them well enough. So, you know, there's all kinds of reasons.
Yeah, I do see people all the time online asking, you know, is this a male? Is this a female? And then you'll see a variety of answers a lot of times underneath in the comments section. And, you know, at that point, you've already put in, you know, 2-3 weeks into this plant. So I think the time savings is the big one. You know, I'm so excited. So we recently ordered some cards. We are going to be offering them through Kiss Organics as another service, you know, to be able to purchase these gender ID kits. And I'm really excited to work with you guys on that, full disclosure. And so the price, just for people who are interested and just listening to the podcast and might want to know more, ranges, it looks like from $10 to $15 a plant. You have a card, the minimum would be 4 plants. So you're looking at $60 to try it out. Can you talk about what that process is for someone who receives a kit in the mail?
Absolutely. Yeah. So we do have variable pricing. So if you're doing it at scale, we of course want to help you out, and it helps us out to be able to do it in bulk. And so we give you a discount on bulk orders. And when you're receiving your kit, what you get is a collection card. And on that collection card, you're going to take a little tiny piece of that plant and you're going to press and squish. I like to actually use the back of a Sharpie marker to rub back and forth over that card to really press that plant material onto the card. And all that juice is really going to soak into that special paper that DNA sticks to, and it breaks down proteins. And then you just send that card back to us. And what we do is we just take a little hole punch of the card and just do a simple test. And we use multiple markers, which is really nice. And that's something that's unique about our sexing, is that we have 5 markers across the Y chromosome that we look for instead of just using one. All of our competitors are just using a single marker. And that's important because not all males have all of the markers. We have a lot of diversity in cannabis, as we talked about. And so we really wanted to make sure that we offered the most robust test and we weren't missing any males. And that's why it was really important for us to have multiple markers that were spread out across that Y chromosome so we never missed anybody. And so we take in that card, we take a little piece of that paper, we do that assay, and then we let you know via email which plants with which tags are male and female.
Great. That makes it really easy. You know, when I first started looking into this and wanting to offer a gender ID kit, you know, you go online and you see other kits that are less expensive. And then I think you were the one actually that had to explain to me that, you know, those kits, you actually have to have a lab or other tools in order to really process them. Can you touch on that?
Yeah. Yeah, so you can buy I guess there's one that's like $5 a sample, but you have to actually have a PCR machine, and you have to do the work yourself. You actually have to do all of the lab work, which of course requires a $15,000 to $40,000 machine and a person that knows how to do PCR and a whole bunch of pipetters to be able to do the PCR, which are, several $100s each. And so unless you're really, equipped to put a whole lab on your farm, it's not really the cheap solution that you think it is, because you do need all of the infrastructure in order to be able to do the test itself.
That's great. Yeah, that was just something,
So,
when you do a quick Google
yeah,
search, it's not very clear the differences there.
yeah,
So I just wanted to
yes.
mention that for people.
No, I appreciate that because it's funny. It's like, oh, but we can do this for $5. It's like, yeah, but do you have a PCR machine?
Yeah.
And like, how many of those do you have to do? And if you were like, oh, I'll buy a PCR machine, it's like, well, you have to do 500,000 of these to break even now. So, it depends on, if your farm that's doing that, it might be worth it. But I don't think that everyone is at the scale where it breaks I don't know, it breaks even very easily.
Yeah. So for people that want just the gender ID, this is a great way to do it. What is the process for someone who wants to be more involved with, the cultivar registration side of things? What does that process look like?
Yeah. So this is a wonderful thing. So if you're a breeder, you have a special plant, you can do a cultivar registration on your plant. But if you hold, like we have also individuals that hold these immense collections, so they're not breeders. They just have had these plants for a long time. And we also do cultivar registrations for them where we take in the plant, we do the botanical description, and we then take it and look at our other reference material to make sure that if they say it's plant A, it is in fact plant A. And this has been really good for a lot of reasons. If you are, a breeder, it makes sense that you're defining your material and you're getting all those ducks in a row to really have the documentation you need together. If you're a collector, it's also a really good way to understand the plants you have, especially if you're someone who grows plants in multiple locations. Those cultivar registrations and that process can really help you understand, like let's say you have 3 farms, which farm is the best to grow what plant. And so there's a lot of additional benefits. And that sort of plays in and dovetails into a lot of the work that is coming into the epilatory frameworks that are happening around not only California, but are starting to percolate in other states as well. And so that cultivar registration is really a great way of documenting the plants you have and being able to leverage that information to the best use for your organization.
Yeah, I'm looking at this page right now, and it's pretty interesting the amount of information you get about a particular cultivar. So 2 questions. One, what would I send you in order for you to do this service? And then 2, in regards to this service, I see you don't have any pricing. Are you able to give a range of sort of what something like this might cost, or is that not something?
Definitely. Yeah. No, I definitely can. So if you're registering a single plant, it's $5,500 to do a single plant. And if you're doing multiple plants, that price goes down. We visit the farm, or we send you a kit such that you can do the herbarium portion yourself, making the pressings. And then we have our staff botanist take that information and write that botanical description. We take in pedigree history, and we do all of those aspects of the registration and basically present to you. And we do the genetics, link those together, and then we present to you. It's almost like a little magazine that pulls all that information together and is this little document that you have in order, to share about the plant itself with other people, customers, other people who maybe want to grow your plant if you're a breeder. And then it also gives you that tool set with the genetics that are linked so that if you have any additional utility, you can utilize those tools to track your plants, articulate what's interesting about them. You can use it if you are going the IP route with your lawyer as part of your docket. All of those components can then be utilized for those purposes as well.
Yeah, I highly suggest that people go onto the LeafWorks website and look at the cultivar registration page, just because it's a really interesting, the way, like you said, it's almost like a little magazine about that particular plant. In this case, your example is a pistachio chai. It's just kind of interesting to read. So even if you don't ever plan on registering a plant, it's just kind of an interesting thing to look at.
Yeah, and the nice thing is where this is going. And so let's say we've registered pistachio chai, and now I'm an extract maker, and I'm buying pistachio chai flower from a farm. I can now take my flower and send it into LeafWorks and verify that I have the plant I say I have, so that I can put a little LeafWorks certified seal on my product, whether it be, a vape pen or some rosin or any other kind of product, so that then I can convey to my customers exactly what's in that label. And so we're really moving toward bringing cannabis into the fold and treating it just like we do the other plants, such that, especially if I'm a product maker that's one step away from the farm, it's a way that I can have assurance that I'm getting the flower I think I'm getting. I can have some assurance through a third party that, not only is it the flower I think it is, but it's not, cut with trim from something else. And then I can also convey that to my customers. And, as we get, just like we were talking about earlier, as we get more and more refined in our own consumer desires, being able to really articulate what plant is in the product and having the customer have confidence that they're really getting what they want, it's going to be beneficial for everyone. So let's say that I've made a pre-roll with a certain plant, pistachio chai, and then you have made this beautiful extract. If I know I like pistachio chai and I see these two products and they both are LeafWorks certified, it is that plant in the product, I'm more likely to buy your product because I know I'm going to like the plant. And so what it does is it gives this confidence, and it's a confidence that's then shared between brands. And so it increases the brand equity because you know that label means something.
So along those lines, I assume it's a lot less expensive to do a check on a plant than it is to do this whole registration. What does something like that cost if you wanted to just check to see if the genetics matched what you thought they did of something you'd already
so just doing a double check. Yeah, so a plant double check is $250 for a single double check. And then of course if you're doing a bunch of double checks, we sell those in bulk as well.
Okay. And then if I did go down this, let's say as a grower, you want to do this cultivar registration, is there any risk of, potentially losing that plant to the lab? Like, could you take what you are collecting and somehow grow out this plant through tissue culture or some other methodology?
No, the only access we ever have to the plant is through the herbarium, and it's dried plant material. So you can't really do anything with that other than reference it long term. So you can't tissue culture it, you can't grow it up. If anything, what it is it's a immutable reference that you can point to make sure no one else is stealing your stuff.
Okay. And then last question for you, is there any way to view some of these registrations, like to way to know that like if what I'm trying to create as a certified reference material has already been created, or if there's something similar?
Well, you can always contact LeafWorks. Right now, we've been talking about how to present that in a more user-friendly way, and that requires a lot of web
design
alteration is maybe so that's something that we're talking about. We've done quite a bit of work with the Humboldt Seed Company and their plants. Mostly we're working with them on doing feminized seed certification. So people who really want to know that they're buying feminized seeds, that certification is important to them. And so we that's probably the first thing we're going to put up as a list, a referenceable list, so you can see which cultivars from which organizations have been certified with the feminized seed cert. And then as we do that, we'll grow into adding those cultivar registrations. But, it's this weird interaction between privacy for our customers, but then also getting the word out. So we're figuring that out right now.
Oh, but you're hoping to somehow in the future make some of this information more available to the cannabis community, it sounds like. That's your goal.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, it's absolutely our goal, especially as we start to get, plants that are really utilized by a lot of different people. I know a lot of the BioVortex seeds are grown by a bunch of different farms, and all kinds of different products are made out of those plants. So being able to reference the cultivar registration of like Black Dog, for instance, and then see, Moon Mate is growing it and making these beautiful pre-rolls, and, Braceland Family Farm is making, extracts. And so that is absolutely the shorter long-term goal for that whole process.
Cool. Well, I thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. I hope people, found a lot of this information useful. And I really look forward to working with you in regards to offering these gender ID kits.
Yeah, me too. It's exciting to get it out to more people and help them streamline their process. That's why we're here.
That was Dr. Eleanor Kuntz, co-founder of LeafWorks and Canndor. Don't forget to check out the podcast page at www.kisorganics.com. Just click on the Learn tab, then Podcast. We are also offering 10% off on the LeafWorks Gender ID kits on our website for a limited time in honor of this podcast. These kits are highly accurate, save you a ton of time on sexing your plants, and they also store great if you wanted to get some for a later date and don't need them right away but wanted to take advantage of the sale. And if you haven't already, please take a moment and leave us a comment or review on whatever platform you listen on. I do take the time to read them all and appreciate the feedback. You can also follow us on Instagram at KISOrganics to stay up to date on the latest podcast releases and information. Thanks for listening.